Okay, off we go.
Am I back now? Okay. I need to just open the Waken up. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to pass over to David Oliver to introduce Natasha Hausdorff very shortly. Just if you would like to ask any questions this evening, if you would raise your virtual hand, you can find this in participants, and by your name you will find an indicator for you to enable you to raise a hand. That way we will know you wish to ask a question, and then we will pass that over to you at a convenient time. And we look forward to as many of you partaking in this evening's discussion. I will now pass over to David Oliver, who will make the few introductions.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. First of all, I'll give you a short bio of Natasha. Can you see Natasha? Yes, she's up there. Natasha is a barrister at 6 Pump Court Chambers and the Director of UK Lawyers for Israel. She speaks frequently on international law, foreign affairs and national security. She holds law degrees from Oxford and Tel Aviv universities. She previously worked for American law firm Skadden in London and Brussels. Thereafter, she clerked for the President of the Israeli Supreme Court in Jerusalem, Chief Justice Miriam Nail. Hi, Natasha. Thank you very much for being with us tonight. Before we get on to the hard stuff, can you give us a quick story of your life so far?
Well, certainly. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I was born and bred in London, but I suppose my connection to Israel properly goes back 8 generations. My family have been in the land of Israel since 1847, which is when Azriel Zelig Hausdorff came to Jerusalem from a small village near Leipzig in Germany. And he raised money in the German Jewish community in order to bring it with him to Jerusalem and in order to build in the old city. He built a school and an orphanage and a medical facility center also. So that has certainly been a defining characteristic of my own interest in Israeli history and in the development of this tiny country in the Middle East. Growing up, being born and bred in London, really opened my eyes, I suppose, at a very early stage to the disconnect between the way Israel is represented outside of the country and now increasingly within internal Israeli discussions also, but the disconnect between the representations and the reality. And it's really as I've progressed through formal education into legal education that I started to realize that those misrepresentations were perhaps gaining most traction in the legal arena. And in that sense, my legal studies, I did my law degree at Oxford, and I thereafter trained initially as a solicitor with an American law firm, where I was practicing international arbitration. I took time out from practice to do my master's in public law at Tel Aviv University. And I studied with a renowned Israeli professor, specifically focusing on the law of armed conflict. And that really opened my eyes. I say it was hand in hand, my interest in the way Israel was being perceived in the international community and actually studying the law behind it, laid bare to me the great chasm that exists, unfortunately, in the way that Israel is presented and in the received wisdom around allegations of Israel violating international law. I know you had Maureen Littman on very recently, and from the little that I saw, and I plan to watch the full session with her because it looked fascinating, she referenced the blood libel of allegations of Israel harvesting Palestinian organs. And it is something that was published in a Swedish newspaper, and it's something that crops up every now and again. And she referenced it in the context of these false allegations. that is something that I have seen far more broadly spread, perhaps, and also reflected in a similar way in the way that Israel and international law are represented. And that really drove me to become very much more involved in this area, including my involvement with UK Lawyers for Israel, which is an NGO, a non-profit that looks at combating misrepresentations of international law against Israel, but also the phenomenon of lawfare, which is relatively and involves organizations and occasionally countries trying to use the law as a weapon against Israel. So UK Lawyers for Israel, which was set up by the formidable Jonathan Turner and his wife Caroline Turner, has been doing fantastic work in this field for nearly 10 years. I got involved when I was a student. And it is through my involvement, I would say, with this organization that the knowledge and the experience that I have with respect to the legal challenges that Israel is facing has deepened, and with it, my own interest.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that, Natasha. Okay, so what the subject of tonight is annexation or sovereignty, which we obviously all know about, and Natasha is an expert at it. She wrote an article, I think it was in the Jewish News a couple of weeks ago, and it was titled "Calling Out the Myth of Annexation." So over to you.
Well, David, absolutely right that this is something I've written about recently, because it has certainly been the subject of the last several weeks that seems to have dominated not just discussion within the Jewish community, but also spilling out into the national press. And we in the UK saw our own Prime Minister Boris Johnson taking the opportunity to write an op-ed in Hebrew in the most widely read newspaper in Israel. That struck me as pretty extraordinary, not least because, unfortunately, the position taken by the UK government and by many other governments in Europe and well, around the world is based on the term that you've just used, annexation, and a misapplication of that term. And I would say double standards in international law. And before we can have any informed debate, or before we can hope to properly discuss the proposals and the pros and the cons of what is being considered, namely the application of Israeli civilian law to certain parts of the West Bank, before we can have really an informed conversation about that, there are two things that we need to be absolutely clear on. The first is that this is not annexation. Annexation, and many commentators have recently been quoting the Oxford Public International Law Encyclopedia definition of annexation in international law, and that says that it means the forcible acquisition of territory by one state at the expense of another state. So the first thing to be clear about here is that we're not talking about any other state's territory. And what I would propose to spend sort of the first chunk of this session just establishing, laying out, is the status of the territory in international law that we're talking about. But annexation, on the basis of that definition, we've seen examples of it over the decades. I mean, it's certainly what Russia did most recently in 2014 with respect to Crimea. It's what in 1940 the USSR did with respect to the Baltic states. It's what Germany did with the Anschluss with Austria in 1938. And it's what Jordan tried to do between 1967, between 1948 and 1967, when it had control of the West Bank. In many instances, annexation is a violation of international law. But if the first point is that what Israel is proposing is not annexation, then the second point follows that it is not a violation of international law. And part of the reason I think that when you asked for an introduction, that I focused on my own realizations of, the blood libels against Israel filtering into this accusation that Israel violates international law, part of the reason I focused on that is because I see it as incredibly powerful that this seems to be playing out in our own lifetimes, and that it is gaining traction when one sees the sort of op-eds. And I don't even mean the op-eds that we had that perhaps caused most consternation, suggesting that the two-state solution is dead and that there should now be a one-state solution, which of course has traditionally been calling for the eradication of the state of Israel. But even before we get to those extremes, the groupthink that has been generated is of one voice, and it is a voice which misses the fundamental point, unfortunately, by adopting this terminology of annexation, and by the same token, by adopting this notion that this would be an extension of sovereignty. In order to explain why this is so wholly incorrect, we turn to international law, and we turn to customary international law, which provides a universal principle for the establishment of the borders of states at independence. Now, this principle developed in the 19th century in South America. It was subsequently applied in Asia and in Africa, and at the dissolution of the former Soviet federations. It's been universally applied, and it's been recognized by the International Court of Justice as the universal principle to be applied at the formation of new states, at what the court called the critical date, which is the date of independence. And the reasoning of the court in explaining how this principle came to be established was to say that international law at its heart seeks to prevent confusion. It seeks to create stability and an environment in which people can endure. And it seeks to avoid what the court called fratricidal struggles that might otherwise erupt at the independence of new states. And so the principle that was established is that a new state inherits the pre-existing lines of the entity that preceded it. Now, often these are administrative lines, and certainly this has been the case in the examples I alluded to, but it's also been universally applied to states emerging from mandate. Now, I think at this point, if I briefly share my screen, we can see the line that I'm talking about when it comes to lines that Israel inherited under this fundamental principle of customary international law, which is called uti possidetis juris. I'd certainly encourage everyone with an interest in this to look up the term, and I can certainly type it into the chat during the Q&A session. But what we have after the creation of Transjordan by the British, where it severed this territory from the whole of the mandate territory, which if that switches the map, hopefully you will see what the mandate for Palestine originally looked like before that division was made. But going back to the severance, what we have running along the Jordan River and all the way south to the Red Sea is the eastern boundary of the British mandate. According to the principle of uti possidetis juris, which is the default rule in these situations, so it applies unless there's been any agreement to the contrary. According to that principle, this is the boundary that Israel inherited at the critical date, the moment of independence, on the 14th of May, 1948. And on that basis, the territory within that eastern border, including the West Bank and including East Jerusalem, has under this principle been sovereign Israeli territory since 1948. Now, that doesn't mean that the Israeli government necessarily, and certainly successive governments have shown this is not the case, it doesn't mean that the Israeli government expects that always to be the sovereign territory of the State of Israel. As I indicated, successive Israeli governments have shown themselves willing to negotiate over that, and have shown themselves desirous of creating either a Palestinian autonomy or a Palestinian state. In fact, through the Oslo process, a Palestinian autonomy was created. But in order to grapple with this accusation that Israel violates international law, we need to go back to the starting point, and we need to test what the status of the territory was at Israel's declaration of independence in 1948. Now, that situation in 1948 was maintained, even though Jordan occupied East Jerusalem and the West Bank between 48 and 67. Jordan's presence there doesn't, and the court makes this clear in its Burkina Faso Mali judgment in 1986, that the principle applies regardless of possession of territory. And again, this comes back to the importance that international law places on clean lines, on stability of borders, and on what is commonly referred to as territorial integrity, which means Israel would not lose sovereignty over the territory simply because Jordan seized it from the state of Israel in the 48-49 war. Similarly, the international community does not believe that Ukraine has lost its sovereignty over Crimea, even though that was seized by Russia. And I think the real test that we have to ask ourselves on the question of annexation is this, is whether anyone would accuse would accuse Ukraine of annexing Crimea if at some point it were able to retake that territory from Russia. And the answer would be a resounding no. The fact that this term is therefore being used against Israel in this context, in my respectful submission, is blatant double standards. And that is the real violation of international law, because a fundamental principle of international law, as well as the fundamental principle of uti possidetis juris, another fundamental principle is its equal application. You cannot have a set of rules and an exception for a country you don't like very much, or you have some ideological or political opposition to. That's just not how any reasonable legal system can work. And when you do introduce double standards, I think you move away from a legal system. It's not, certainly it's where politics comes into play in a big way, but it does cause the integrity of the whole system to be called into question. It's really not how you run a legal system, it's how you run a lynch or a lynching. And it's this groupthink which undoubtedly has overtaken much of the political discourse, because it's this political term of annexation which is being abused to suggest a violation of international law on Israel's part. And it's that rhetoric on international law, which quite frankly is entirely at odds with the reality. And it's slanderous. Of course, that doesn't stop international organizations and governments around the world from indulging in this misrepresentation. And even eminent law professors have been indulging in this herd mentality of everybody says. My response in the Jewish News, David, that you alluded to, was prompted by a letter that was signed on to by very eminent lawyers and judges, even from this country, from the UK, condemning Israel's so-called proposed annexation. And it was that prompted me to write this response, because it was clear now, of course, these lawyers and judges are not necessarily practitioners of international law, and they undoubtedly are influenced by what they read in the press and the sort of groupthink that I alluded to. And it's not easy to push back against what has become a tsunami of slander. Even supporters of Israel undoubtedly find that incredibly difficult. And I can appreciate a tendency to want to find a path of least resistance. But I do fundamentally think that if that is at the expense of the truth and the justice of the situation, and the just treatment of Israel in the community of nations, then that is the same mistake we've been making every time Israel is discriminated against in the world, every time double standards are applied to Israel, and really every time Israel is smeared. And that is why, and I appreciate it's an emotive and it's a strong comparison to make, but that is why I felt inclined, having heard Maureen Littman's reference so recently to that blood libel, that modern blood libel, to draw the parallel with this. Of course, the legal situation fuels a lot of the political, or I should say the misrepresentation of the legal situation fuels the political arguments that are being made. But it also utterly misrepresents and I think prevents people from understanding exactly what it is that Israel is proposing. And if I just give you a short overview of that, I'd be delighted to take questions on this or any other aspect of Israel and the politics and the law as it's applied to it today. The administrative regime that Israel applied in 1967 to the West Bank, once it regained that territory from Jordan, was intended to be temporary. It was anticipated at the time by Israel. It was hoped that a peace agreement would be reached relatively swiftly with Jordan. And Israel anticipated that that agreement would entail some giving up some of that territory, that there would be a change to the sovereignty in that area, and there would be a change to borders. It's important to stress as a corollary, we talked about the legal starting point and the application of uti possidetis juris. Since 1948, there has been no agreement to change sovereignty or borders in this territory. And that's why this starting point is so significant and so important. Israel anticipates that there will be, and it has over the decades sought to negotiate on that basis. But that agreement as yet eludes us. So the system that Israel established to be temporary in 1967 has remained now for 53 years. And it has a great deal of criticism around it. There are many in Israel that say it is utterly unreasonable to expect the state to maintain a situation of limbo in this area, a situation where Knesset legislation does not properly apply to these areas. And there's therefore an incredibly confusing patchwork of law that applies to administer this territory. There is leftover Jordanian law, there's leftover Ottoman law that governs a lot of the land transactions. There's leftover law from the British Mandate. And because of the temporary administration that Israel instituted, there is also the application of certain aspects of international humanitarian law, which is why you have military rule in that territory. You have military courts that are established by reason of the fact that because of the administrative framework that Israel has applied, and the obligations that it has taken onto itself, it is mandated by international law only to try non-Israeli citizens within military courts. Most people don't know that. And so they think when Israel applies military law, it's doing it for its own nefarious ends. It couldn't be further from reality. And what you also don't have in this confusing patchwork is environmental law, or the sorts of laws that the rest of Israel benefits from that regulate 21st century issues. This is fundamentally what the proposals come down to, not annexation, not an extension of sovereignty, because we've seen that the legal starting point is that Israel is underlyingly sovereign there, but the application of the civilian law that is applied in the rest of Israel to certain parts of this territory, which will replace the military law I mentioned, and also streamline and provide a much clearer framework, legal framework for residents living there. And this is potentially appropriate to come on to a really important point here, which is one that the misrepresentations on the law, I think, prevent us from actually getting to grips with, is what will the impact be on the residents of these areas, Jewish and non-Jewish, Israeli and non-Israeli. And we can't be entirely sure about this because, importantly, the proposals have not yet been formulated. Everything is still up in the air. People were talking about the 1st of July as a deadline. Again, entirely incorrect. The coalition agreement set the 1st of July as the starting point for discussions to take place in the Knesset. And so this month was supposed to be the lawmakers coming together and formulating not just the maps of which areas would necessarily be affected by these proposals, but also how these proposals would manifest themselves, and what benefits would be given to residents of the areas that were not Israeli citizens. Now, the model for this that many people have been talking about is that which was applied in East Jerusalem, when Israel did exactly the same thing, applying its law, administration, and jurisdiction in East Jerusalem in 1967. As a side point here, But Abba Eban at the time wrote a formal representation to the UN Secretary General, because the same hullabaloo existed, and Israel was being resoundingly condemned in the international community. And Abba Eban, the former then foreign minister, made it explicitly clear that what Israel was doing in East Jerusalem was not annexation. The same principle applies in this case. I will be the first one to accept that you have not been hearing a clear message on that from the Israeli government. And there are a plethora of reasons for the confusion over language. Part of it is that the formulation of the proposals has not yet happened, but also a significant part of it is that the legal situation that I outline is not one that Israel has been putting to the forefront, because diplomatically speaking, it has shown itself over the decades willing to retreat from that. And so it doesn't necessarily help on a diplomatic footing when you are trying to negotiate over the route forward to go back to the original starting point. But for our purposes and for understanding the allegations that are made against Israel, it's crucial. The last thing I would just say about the actual proposals, and if we look at the model of East Jerusalem and apply it in the absence of formalized proposals as yet, what Israel did in '67 was the non-residents of non-Israeli citizens in the area became residents of Israel, and they have the opportunity to apply for citizenship. Now, residency, if this model is applied with respect to the West Bank, brings with it certain benefits, including access to healthcare, social security benefits, and the right to vote in municipal elections. And the opportunity to apply for citizenship, of course, brings with it all of the benefits of being a citizen in the only democracy in the Middle East. One thing I don't know how many people are aware of, a reporter in Israel for Channel 13 News called Tzvi Yechezkeli. He's the head of the Arab desk at the Channel 13. And he, a few weeks ago, took it upon himself to go into the disputed territories and interview ordinary Palestinians about what they thought, if they would be impacted by these proposals. And their answers, and I stress their identities, were hidden, their voices were changed and their faces were blocked out. And they were very forthcoming and open with their desire to be residents of Israel over and above residents of the Palestinian Authority, principally because of the corruption and the difficulties that they face under Palestinian leadership, and the benefits that they would inevitably receive as Israeli residents or even citizens. It's incredibly unfortunate that the recent reports are that many of those that were interviewed, even though their identities were hidden, or it was attempted to conceal them, have subsequently been arrested, and some of their families also. So a big problem that we have in being able to, and I have to stress, sorry, it's obvious to me, but it might not be to all of our listeners, they were arrested by the Palestinian Authority, because it is desperately unfortunate that freedom of speech as it exists in Israel does not exist in the areas in which the Palestinian Authority rules, and that is principally Area A, and in a civil sense in Area B, also in the West Bank. That is, I think, a side of the dynamic that is certainly not something I've seen discussed in the traditional media outside of Israel. And the other, and I promise the final point I'll just raise on the proposal and the discussion of its implications, is just to debunk this myth that it is somehow the nail in the coffin of the two-state solution. Now we can have a separate discussion about the merits of that and whether it is naive to still believe in it or whether there is any merit in it. But the important thing to be clear on is that this proposal in no way prejudices negotiations over a future two-state solution. It has been Israel's practice to negotiate over sovereign Israeli territory over the decades. The application of Israeli civilian law has not affected the territory that has been subject to those negotiations in the past. In fact, in Trump's so-called deal of the century, the proposal includes significant chunks of the Negev, undisputed Israeli sovereign territory being transferred via land swaps as part of the peace proposals. So in that sense, Israel's application of civil law in parts of Area C does not affect the ability of either party to negotiate in the future. But it's also important to note, and this is something that Ambassador Regev noted a number of times before he left London, is that the territory that Israel is talking about with respect to these proposals is territory that it has been understood for a long time. Israel will have to maintain a presence in. It concerns the significant settlement blocks, but it also concerns the Jordan Valley, which is along the border with Jordan, and that is fundamentally important for Israel militarily and from a security standpoint. And that's also, I think, something just important to keep in mind. Now, I appreciate I've talked at you all for a substantial amount of time, and I'm really keen to take your questions and to hear what aspects of this have been particularly interesting to you and to get that discussion going.
David. Hello. He's gone. David, have we got any questions at the moment?
I have one, if interestingly.
Oh, okay.
There's nobody else online at the moment. Natasha, I've obviously heard what you've said, and rightly or wrongly, what we regard as sovereignty, many others regard as annexation. Israel's government has approved the plans to annex, to use a word, a substantial portion of the West Bank. What might Israel gain by discarding a reasonably tolerant and surprisingly sustainable status quo for a step that virtually the entire world considers a violation of law and reason? And my second question to that is, what costs might Israel incur strategically, diplomatically, politically, or otherwise for carrying out what the outside world see as annexation? For some reason you're muted, so sorry, Natasha, I don't understand why.
Lovely. Sorry,
oh, you're back in. Sorry.
I'm able to unmute myself without your permission. So you've asked about the costs and the benefits with that, and I'll take them in that order. We've heard so often with respect recently to the US recognition of Jerusalem, with respect to the US embassy move embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and even with respect to the US recognition of Israeli sovereignty in the Golan Heights. At each of these decisions, the same warnings were issued with respect to the cost to Israel and to the region of instability, of backlash, of diplomatic relations suffering. And in none of these cases did those warnings come true. So I would just take everything that's being said about, this being the end of the world and the sky falling in as a result of Israel changing the administrative framework in certain parts of the West Bank, in areas where its jurisdiction was confirmed by the Oslo Accords 25 years ago, that the sky falling in over this is somewhat irrational. And what I put this hyperbole down to is the representations around the move as opposed to the move itself. And that's where language becomes so crucial. And that's where the misrepresentation of annexation really takes hold. And I think the longer that we use these false terms, the harder it's going to be to push back against these misrepresentations. So far as Israel's diplomatic relationship in the region is concerned, over the last 10 years, we have seen that flourishing in a way that people wouldn't have dreamt of previously. And that is a relationship that has been based significantly over, increasingly, I would say, over security cooperation. And that is not something that will necessarily be that easy to give up for many of these countries. I'd say that so far as the move is viewed within the region, it's also important to understand that in the Middle East, strength is a quality that is respected in countries. And with respect to these proposals, which I have to stress don't come out of some American dream or playbook for peace. These are proposals that have been mooted and discussed internally in Israel for decades now. And it's in this particular political context and with a supportive administration in the US that they are potentially gaining traction and possibly coming to fruition. But it is something that has come internally from Israel. It's not being imposed from the outside. And as a sign of strength, in particular, against the sort of international rhetoric that Israel has been facing, I think it's just important to remember how differently that position would be maybe viewed in the region. Certainly we have had outward statements from neighbouring countries that are not positive with respect to the move. But I think it's also important to remember, as in international relations, this is by no means an unusual occurrence, that what countries say to the world and what they say quietly between each other may be indeed very different things. I indicated that the security cooperation is going to be difficult to completely turn their backs on, and I think that is a key factor in terms of Israel maintaining the positive relationships that it has developed in the region. And I also think in terms of prompting future cooperation, that there are certainly arguments around the stability and the certainty in the Jordan Valley that the application of Israeli civilian law would bring, creating incredible investment opportunities and cooperation in terms of industry with Jordan in that region. And we all know that Jordan is not financially in a very strong position at the moment. Any new initiatives and projects in that respect would no doubt be welcomed by the kingdom as well. So there's a lot to consider. There is no straightforward answer, and all I would do is just caution against a particular narrative that says that only harm can come of this in terms of the costs. In terms of the benefits, and I'm not necessarily here saying that this is something Israel should absolutely 100% do. I think that's a decision for the Israeli government. It is one only properly that the democratically Israeli government should be taking. And I don't believe that it should be influenced by the misinformed influences that have been emanating from the international community. But the reasons that have been raised for it are those that I described, to do with ending the confusing patchwork of administrative law that applies to this territory, but also creating those sorts of opportunities for economic investment, and creating a situation in which the Israelis that are living in these territories and that have been now on occasion for generations, that have been for the last 53 years in a sense of limbo, that their situation is slightly firmer in terms of international law, less so, because that situation doesn't change. I mean, it's not changing the status of the territory at all in international law. That's important to stress. But in terms of the Israeli internal legal administration, and I just want to take a minute so that everyone understands why it is that these people have been kept in limbo for this number of decades. And it's because the Palestinian leadership has been supported by the international community in terms of its negotiating position with Israel, with the approval of a negotiating position that says that any state of Palestine, any future state of Palestine, would need to be cleansed of any Jews living there. The reason that these settlements are still kept in limbo is because the negotiations have worked on the principle that certain areas would need to be evacuated in the way that Israel evacuated settlements from the Gaza Strip. And that has been a demand of the Palestinian leadership. that has been, in some cases, made desperately explicit in English and in Arabic, that there will not be a single Jew in a future state of Palestine. That is an appalling position for the international community to be lending credibility to. But that is the underlying issue behind the pushback, I think, that you have seen. Certainly there isn't a basis in the legal. It's not a reflection, as I said, of the reality as much as the rhetoric of international law. And one of the reasons that people are able to get away with this misinformation, which, and David, I say this respectfully, but it underpinned sort of every aspect of the question that you posed to me. One of the reasons that they have been able to get away with this campaign of disinformation is that international law is nebulous enough and removed enough from the majority of people that they don't know enough about it to know when they're being lied to about it. They are unable, because they don't have the tools, to distinguish between the rhetoric and the reality of international law. And to the extent that having sessions like this and the work that I'm doing with UK Lawyers for Israel on evenings, nights and weekends can start to educate on the issues around this and provide people with the tools to successfully push back on this rhetoric. Well, that's what it's all about.
But of course, how do these people sift through the information that they're given to make that determination whether it's fact or fiction?
Absolutely. And before we started, David was telling me that he'd started reading about the issue over the last couple of days, and he was just overwhelmed with the amount of information there. I would suggest asking a very simple question. Where else has this principle, this law that is being applied against Israel, where else has it been applied? In what other context? What other country has been accused of this? And you will find that the answer is nowhere. It's a unique allegation that is made against the Jewish state. And it's not the case that real situations of occupation, real situations of annexation don't exist. They do. They are not talked about in the terms that Israel is denigrated in the international community. I mean, I've spoken now a couple of times at the UN Human Rights Council. I mean, that is the theatre of the absurd in terms of the allegations that are made against Israel, real blood libels made against Israel. And at the same time, obviously, that council is the very council that is whitewashing what some would say genocides and crimes against humanity in many other parts of the world. It's really that fundamental question that I would encourage people to ask themselves, to discover the double standards that are being exercised or applied against Israel that are not being applied anywhere else in the world. And just to add one other factor to that issue, because another area in which this is a huge problem, and it was the focus of my postgraduate study, is the law of armed conflict. And the same sorts of allegations of violations of international law and breaches of proportionality are made against Israel, and they are as baseless. This application or this non-application, this abuse of international law against Israel, is unique to Israel. It is not applied against other countries. And it's not just a case that this is, it's an extreme double standard, because it's not just the case that Israel is breaching international law and other countries are breaching international law and Israel is being called out for it. In these contexts, not only is Israel upholding international law, but as far as the law of armed conflict is concerned, there is material that has been written by military experts talking about the lengths that Israel goes to prevent civilian casualties and the standards that it upholds, Israel being the most moral army in the history of warfare. Now, there are reasons, strategic reasons that Israel has taken to ensure that it upholds international law and applies these standards and often goes above what international law requires when it is fighting in incredibly difficult circumstances and dealing with civilians being used as human shields and all of the difficulties that it faces, for example, in the last few conflicts it's had with Hamas in Gaza. But the the important thing is that despite Israel operating at this incredibly high level, these false allegations of violations of international law are still being made against it, while the real violators of international law are being exonerated. And that is, it's a problem. But it's a problem that I think if we ignore, it only worsens. And unfortunately, Israel itself has not taken up this PR battle, if you will, in the way that it ought to have done. I certainly have sensed an attitude in Israel amongst Israelis, well, we know what we do is correct and right and according to the standards of international law. We don't need to explain ourselves. I see that position now changing slightly, where the Palestinian leadership has, and I would say in breach of the Oslo Accords, blatantly breaching the Oslo Accords, sought to resort to international tribunals, importantly now at the International Criminal Court, in order to bring these politicized allegations and false allegations of violations of international law against Israel in situations where it might actually have some significant impact on, it's not just discussions at the UN or UN resolutions which don't have any binding force. This is a situation that could actually impact ordinary Israelis and prevent them from traveling to countries under threat of arrest warrants, international arrest warrants against them. And I think increasingly now the state and the government is waking up to the need for explaining yourself, not just knowing that you are adhering to the law, but also tackling the misrepresentations, tackling the false allegations, tackling the blood libels, and not resting on your laurels and thinking, well, the people that matter aren't going to believe that nonsense, because increasingly the people that matter are being consumed by the groupthink.
Okay, I have many more questions for you, and I could probably talk to you for the next 4 hours, but I'm conscious there are other people who want to ask me questions. I will bring in younger words, male or female. Which of them?
Hi, I'm male at the moment, yeah. And Natasha, very lucid, very, very convincing. There's just one thing which worries me, and perhaps like a good lawyer will be a devil's advocate, because you touched briefly on the scenario a few weeks ago of, I think, hundreds of very eminent Jewish lawyers writing in terms saying this is, and writing as lawyers in terms this is unlawful annexation. And we're all used to unfair tropes by our enemies, which we can deal with in a separate way. But most of these lawyers are not our enemies, they are Zionists. And they seem to be saying, we believe, not simply it's not a good idea, it's unlawful. And you seem to be saying, if I may praise your comment, that they've just got it totally wrong, the very meaning of the term annexation. And that seems so puzzling. I mean, all lawyers can make mistakes. We all know that. I mean, I haven't studied international law. It doesn't take too much skill, it seems to me, to understand that the legal term annexation is being given a very, very strained and, in your opinion, which I agree with, a wrong interpretation. Now, if they were here, some of them, I just wonder what they would say. And I just wonder, I mean, I'd be going totally off on the wrong tangent, so I don't know this aspect of the law. I wonder what they'll be saying in terms that old principles of international law based on borders and sovereignty have in terms been nullified or overtaken by events such as wars, other agreements, Oslo, etc., etc., etc. I mean, if they were here, would they just simply be saying, this is what we think annexation is, and going no further than that, or could they put it in a more powerful way?
I might start just with a short plug for the Jewish Chronicle on Friday, in which I do go head-to-head with Professor John Strawson of the University of East London on this very issue. And so you will be able to see the pro and contra arguments side by side. But having had this discussion with some of the signatories of that letter, I would preface my comments by saying that I don't know that everyone necessarily would have an answer and would be able to explain why it is that they say what they say. And that is the danger when it comes to groupthink that I alluded to earlier. But what you allude to is absolutely correct in that, for example, this is how the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court responded to my submissions on a similar issue by saying that the modern conceptions of human rights and dignity and the Palestinian self-determination are too important to bother about public fundamental principles of public international law like this one. That was the essence, if I can précis her argument, the essence of it. There are two fundamental problems with that. The first is, another fundamental principle of international law called the intertemporal rule. And it mirrors what we have, to the extent that we have lawyers on the line, a principle in English law, in domestic law, which is that you have to apply the law that applied at the time of whatever factual scenario, factual matrix that you are dealing with. And so that's why I go back to 1948, to the establishment of the State of Israel, to say, well, what was the original status of the territory, and what does international law tell us about Israel's sovereign territory at its declaration of independence? And we have a cookie cutter answer, which has been affirmed by the International Court of Justice as the only answer in situations where there is no alternative agreement. This is the default rule. I indicated that, but I stress that. So had Israel entered into an agreement with its neighbors that uti possidetis juris wouldn't apply, and that there would be a different set of borders, we'd be having a different conversation, but that never happened. So the intertemporal rule is key. The law as it applied in 1948 is key to establishing what the underlying situation is. But I stress that I'm not here advocating that Israel should maintain sovereignty over all of the West Bank, just because that was the starting position in 1948. I mean, Israel has been the first to recognize that the importance of achieving a peaceful solution means that, the law aside, you find a political solution which you agree on, and then you write a legal agreement that changes the status of the territory, and you redraw those borders. And that has been the aim of Israel with respect to its neighbors. And of course, it has withdrawn from significant amounts of the territory. It withdrew for all of Sinai that it captured from Egypt in 1967. It subsequently withdrew also from the Gaza Strip. But I go off on one slightly. The last issue I would pick up on from your question is this issue of self-determination, which has taken on a fundamental importance in international law in more recent years. And the reason I highlight it is because I think it is key to what you raise about the priorities that international law has today over when Israel was founded. Even self-determination, which is argued by some to be jus cogens. I mean, it's almost a holy grail of international law, does not affect the situation in the way that a few law professors seek to argue, for this simple reason. Self-determination does not give you a right to a state of your own. If it did, we would have very many more states in the world. If it did, for starters, the Kurds would have a state yesterday. What self-determination provides is a right of self-governance. It's actually something that the vast majority of Palestinians already have because they are governed by the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, in Area A and in Area B. They should be voting for the Palestinian Authority. Unfortunately, Mahmoud Abbas is now in the 14th year of his term, but that is a matter for the Palestinians. It's not Israel's place to regulate the frequency of their elections or to attempt to combat the corruption that exists within the Palestinian Authority. The principle that self-determination doesn't give you a right to a state of your own was famously acknowledged, and it's such a famous case that people argue it's become a principle of customary international law through it. In the Supreme Court of Canada, when it considered the secession of Quebec in 1998, it set out quite clearly, what self-determination is meant to afford people. And the reason that self-determination doesn't give you a state of your own is because, and I mentioned this earlier, of the importance of territorial integrity. You cannot start chipping away at states. That is the way that the international system has been established, and that is the importance in terms of sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the state as the chief unit of governance. You cannot, in the international legal system, allow certain parties to just break away as states without there being a political consensus or solution to that. So that's just picking out a couple of the issues that I think would potentially be raised. But of course, you're right to call out the fundamental issue. And I go back to that, that's the reason that I was asked to write that piece in response to that letter, because we are absolutely at odds with the allegation that this would be a violation of international law, and the allegation that this is annexation. And the reason that I, in the face of these eminent lawyers and judges, remain confident is that this is quite a straightforward issue. And I invite anyone to look up the definition of annexation in the Oxford International Law Encyclopedia. It's available free of charge online, and I would encourage you to make up your own minds on that basis.
David? And, Stephen Truman. You're muted.
Thank you, Natasha. I have a question that's a little bit out of the box, and I forgive me if others people on this conference think that it's out of the box. There's a purpose for it, but in terms of the discrepancy between international law to the letter of it and the hearts and minds, which is obviously so powerful, public opinion, world opinion, it plays its part. Are there any parallels between China and Hong Kong? And if we're going to take Israel's part in this, whose side should we be on, the Hong Kong or China's side?
I struggle with seeing parallels, although the issue was raised recently because the Palestinian Authority, I believe, came out pretty strongly in China's defense. Which some people have argued is entirely contrary to their line of argument at certain international tribunals. But the intellectual curiosities of that aside, the issue with China is a human rights issue. And the issue with Israel has also always been a human rights issue. It's just that in the case of Israel, it is inverted in the way that it is presented in the international community.
Talking about, imagine territorial law, international territorial law, is China within its rights to do what it's doing?
I see. So again, on that basis, I would also struggle to draw any parallels, because the relationship of China to Hong Kong is governed by agreements that it has signed itself up to, and responsibilities that it has undertaken. And so when we talk about international law, we talk about a number of sources of international law. Customary international law is one that I've spoken to at great length this evening, because it's where we get the principle of uti possidetis juris from. And custom tends to develop over a substantial period of time, and it is derived, you can sort of see once it's emerged, from state practice. So if states behave in a certain way for a substantial period of time, believing themselves to be bound in that way, then custom says that becomes binding law. So it's unusual, and it is pretty unique, I would say, to the international legal system. What we're dealing with when it comes to the Chinese and Hong Kong is treaty law. And treaty law in the international realm, the easiest parallel would be to talk about contract law. When you sign yourself up to a contract, you undertake legal obligations. And that is something, that is a power that states have to bind themselves to contractual agreements, treaties, either bilateral ones with individual states, or international ones, multilateral ones with groups of states. And so the situations are worlds apart, both in terms of the territorial question, but also in terms of the issue of human rights.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, can I ask a question? Completely changing the subject, actually. Last week, the BBC won the case against the Labour Party that was brought against them, and they were fined. What are the legal implications
of that decision? I think we're still pretty early days. I was reading today that and it's Mark Lewis for Patron Law that has, I believe, been dealing with many of these cases. He was on the record this afternoon saying that he was taking on the case for John Mann, potentially in his suing the Labour Party. I mean, the big news recently, of course, is that they have apologised and settled with respect to the whistleblowers that they had previously accused of lying. Now, this is multifaceted because it is coming in the wake also of the investigation into Labour Party anti-Semitism, and I think we expect the potential publication of that report at some point if the Labour Party is going to publish it. Twitter was going crazy today at the prospect of Jeremy Corbyn having the whip removed from him as a result of the findings involved in that report. So there's an awful lot in flux at the minute, and I think we'll just have to sort of wait and see, especially with Keir Starmer making it clear that he wants to take a strong line on anti-Semitism. He is going to be put to the test, I'm sure, because it's always going to be inevitably going to be a difficult balancing act for him when he is faced with a Labour Party in which anti-Semitism had for so long taken such a strong hold. You know, it's not just a case of dealing with ministers, shadow ministers that would say the wrong thing every now and again, and making sure that he has a strong response to that. I mean, I think his serious difficulty is that he has a significant part of the party and also still the grassroots that adhere, and I say this advisedly because I appreciate that those attitudes are changing all the time and may in fact be changed by what comes out from this investigation. But it's not going to be an easy job for the new leader of the Labour Party. Not so new anymore, we'll see. But I think we'll have to sort of wait and see what further cases emanate, in particular from the programme that you mentioned.
I've got another question unless somebody wants to go. Anybody else there?
No, there's no one.
Okay. The next question really is a very, very simple one, which I'm sure you can answer in a sentence. Do you think there's any possibility of the two-state solution actually coming to fruition?
I think the unfortunate reality is that one has to have a significant dose of naivete to think that it could. I would certainly hope, but then hope doesn't necessarily always coincide with the reality of the situation in the Middle East. The hope that I have is perhaps principally emanates from the diplomatic relations that Israel has been able to build with neighboring countries. I mentioned this earlier, but the fact that you have alliances which could not have been imagined even a few years ago does indicate very strongly that things can change very substantially. And so in that sense, things may change and there may be hope once again for a form of two-state solution. I stress that the current status quo and the autonomy that the Palestinians have is not as far off from a state as many critics of Israel would allege, and that self-government does exist for the Palestinians in the West Bank. Certainly self-governance exists in the Gaza Strip, and we have seen the unfortunate repercussions of an absence of Israeli security cooperation in the Gaza Strip. And let me explain what I mean by that. The reason Hamas have not been able to take over the West Bank in the same way that they violently took over the Gaza Strip in a military coup in which they threw opposition Fatah members off of the roofs of buildings. The reason they have been prevented from doing that in the West Bank is because of the security cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. Now, Mahmoud Abbas knows this, and anyone who succeeds him will know this, and that is a huge impediment that nobody talks about, and that is a massive disincentive, that reliance on Israeli security cooperation for pushing from the Palestinian leadership's position and the PA's position in the West Bank for pushing for greater autonomy, greater independence. That is a crucial sticking point that nobody really addresses. Likewise, the Palestinian Authority rely on the continuous flooding in of international donations as a result of the perpetuation of the conflict. And Mahmoud Abbas and anyone who succeeds him really rely on a continued demonization of Israel, which has been widely documented in school textbooks, in children's television programs, in the naming of schools with after martyrs, so-called martyrs, people who have committed terror attacks against Israel and killed Israeli civilians, the naming of football teams after them. There is an industry of hate that has been developed by the Palestinian Authority in the classic textbook fashion of any totalitarian regime, generating an outside enemy to which it can allocate all of the problems of the world. That makes it very difficult to maintain the security and the political control that you have over a population if you take away the main plank that has enabled you to establish that control. And that is what the Palestinian Authority would be facing if it sought to make peace with Israel. Now, the leadership's position, I believe, and I say this with some degree of humility, because I see the Palestinian situation not, of course, from the inside, but as a neighbor, if you will, rather than an insider. But what I see there is ordinary Palestinians who seek a better, more prosperous life, that are increasingly frustrated with the Palestinian Authority, and recognize that it is not just Israel that they can blame for their problems and their lack of economic development, but crucially the Palestinian Authority, the corrupt Fatah party that governs them. And again, when I come to the the developments in the Middle East with respect to Israel and its neighbors, that it has been developing positive diplomatic relations with, I think it's really the Palestinian people that need to be relied upon, as opposed to the leadership, because we can forget about them. They clearly have no incentive, as I've described, to seek a peaceful solution. But the people do. And when I have visited Ramallah, I have been most encouraged by going to see venture capital startup funds looking to support Silicon Valley in the West Bank, looking to support industry and generate a successful middle class, which already exists, but to give that middle class a future and prospects of further development and further economic growth. That was a key plank between Israel and Jordanian peace, was economic cooperation. And I think that, well, certainly I know from Israel's perspective, that is what the government has been seeking to drive towards with the Palestinian Authority as well. So rather than a top-down imposition by the international community of a tick box American president slapping himself on the back because he has solved peace in the Middle East, that solution has to come as a grassroots prospect. It is going to take time. It is not going to be a piece of paper which can be signed, unfortunately, and imposed. And the key to this is education, and the fundamental the impasse, I still believe, and it's funded by international donations that produce textbooks that promote intolerance and racism and violence within the Palestinian Authority. And I stress that we are talking about the supposed moderates here. This isn't even to start with Hamas. that this is the key thing from an international perspective that we need to be addressing and be very clear about where our taxpayer money is going and the projects that it is funding. With respect to the Gaza Strip, we have a whole host of other problems. And importantly, I think it's significant to recognize that when people talk about a two-state solution, they totally ignore the chasm that exists between the Fatah, Palestinian Authority-run West Bank, and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Now, the people in the Gaza Strip are in a far worse position than those in the West Bank. They have far fewer freedoms. When I indicated that those exercising freedom of speech on Israeli news a few weeks ago were arrested by the Palestinian Authority, there are reports that they have been arrested and are being tortured for what it is that they said, because it is against the company line, but it is still recognized as the safer place to be than under the dictatorial, despotic, genocidal regime that is Hamas, which rules absolutely and in which there is no freedom, not least freedom for international journalists to report what is really going on there.
I'm the eternal optimist, but I can't see anything going ahead. I don't in my lifetime. I read an article the other day, and it was talking about people that lost war, Poland, Germany, so on and so on and so on, wars generally, and they all get on with it. You know, they had a terrible time, killed, whatever, but they got on with it. The Palestinians, you know, they want something back that they never have, and they never will have. I can't see how they could ever get it back. I mean, you know, there's another story altogether about what's a Palestinian. But I just cannot see, unless they're willing to give, which they're not. Well, they're not all of them, obviously. And as you said, Fatah and Hamas are very, very difficult people to deal with, because they're just focused. I mean, you know, they want Israel. I mean, now how do you ever get rid of that?
But two things I would just raise. One, in terms of your question of what is a Palestinian, well, that is something, certainly a term that has changed over the decades. My grandparents were Palestinian. They were designated as such by the British because they were living in Palestine before the establishment of the State of Israel. And of course, we all know that Palestine at the time was a term that was used with respect to the whole of that territory. The Palestinian football team comprised Jewish players. You had the Palestine tourist board that was promoting tourism to, you know, the Holy Land and Jewish tourism. You had money in Palestine, the Palestine pounds, which said on them Eretz Israel in Hebrew. And the papers that my grandparents were issued with by the British before 1948 said nationality Palestinian, race Jewish. Now, of course, subsequently, and many people date this to Yasser Arafat's creation of Palestinian national identity in the 1960s, we have had a formation of Palestinian national identity, which has developed into these sorts of arguments that we previously discussed in terms of self-determination for the Palestinian people. It's important to see that in the appropriate context and in the historical context. And this involves a bit of a pushback against some of the rewriting of history that has accompanied a lot of the legal arguments. I saw this across a number of briefs that went to the International Criminal Court, the prosecutor, the false arguments on the law are going hand in hand with, you know, the total rewriting of history. One book that I read recently, which has come out relatively recently, on this issue, so on the Palestinian refugee question, by Einat Wilf and Adi Schwartz, deals with, I think, the fundamental point that you're addressing, which is what Palestinian national identity began as, you know, what it is, and how it has focused on the Palestinian narrative of an aim, really, of seeking to I look for another word other than annihilate, but it's one that they use frequently themselves, the state of Israel. This was originally sought to be achieved by military means. Once we conquer the territory, we will push the Jews into the sea. Once they, and I don't just mean the Palestinian leadership in the sense, but also the surrounding Arab countries originally. Once they realized that was no longer feasible, and that was really after 1967, you had the movement towards economic boycotts initiated by the Arab League. That is, still a significant place in the international discourse through what is now the boycott, divestments and sanctions movement. But large-scale boycott was also unsuccessful. So now I think what we see that movement has morphed into is a fight in the legal arena and lawfare being used against the state of Israel. And here they are being more successful. In rewriting the historical narrative, but also in rewriting the legal textbook, and in sometimes inventing international law to apply to Israel, and sometimes just using double standards. But that is the new battlefield. It is the legal battlefield, and it's where the national identity that you referenced and the sort of focus on ending Israel has taken them to.
I think, do we have another question?
David, we have a question. I just wanted to mention, Natasha, actually, I noticed you were talking about a recent survey carried out in the West Bank, was that 66% of West Bankers had as their top priority for the next 5 years to regain all of the historical Palestine for the Palestinians from the river to the sea. And but on that note, I'd just like to bring in either Peter or Sylvia who are asking a question. I would add that there was somebody on here who wanted to ask a question. We didn't recognise the name. They wouldn't show their face on video, so he was duly thrown out as possible trouble. But so I'll unmute Sylvia or Peter.
Am I unmuted?
Both of you.
We're together, that's fine. I don't actually want to ask a question. I actually want to thank you very much from my personal perspective for everything you've done and worked so hard to try and bring forward the truth to a lot of people who don't hear it and don't want to hear it. I hope that everybody in this context tonight is aware and will be more aware because of what you've said. I think that going out into the world as you have done and taking on people whose heads have been so twisted by stuff that they don't even know what they're listening to. And I just want to give my appreciation for everything that you've done. And please carry on our behalf.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm not going anywhere, so I certainly will.
Well, I mean, you've certainly given me a lot of food for thought. And you speak so lucidly. I mean, I understood everything you said, most of it anyway. It was fantastic. I've still got loads and loads of questions to ask you. I got through a couple, but I think we're sort of getting towards the end of it. So can I thank you very, very much on behalf of everybody here. And will you come back and finish off the evening?
Whenever you have another slot available, please let me know.
Next week.
It really has been my pleasure. And if you're not sick of all of the international law by now, I'm shocked, but it would really be delightful to be back with you and to take, once everyone's had the opportunity to go away and to look into this, if there are additional questions, then for sure that we can do a follow-up seminar by all means.
Fantastic. Okay. Thank you very, very much again.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been lovely to meet you all. Good night.
Good night. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. I'm going to end it now. Thank you, Natasha, and good night. Nice meeting you.
I think Flora was just waving. I don't know whether that was goodbye. She's got a question.